Programs on MPT are made possible by our members and the following.
You can discover the behind-the-scenes story of the historic White House restoration. Jacqueline Kennedy and Henry Francis DuPont, From Winneter to the White House, opens May 7th.
Enjoy fine wine, art, and music at the family-friendly Tawnytown 10th Annual Wine, Music, and Arts Festival, Saturday, May 21st, 2022, from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. at the Tawnytown Memorial Park off of Route 140 in Tawnytown, Maryland.
There are risks when buying drugs like heroin, cocaine, crack, and pills off the street. But did you know that any of those drugs could also contain fentanyl? Fentanyl is an opioid 50 times stronger than heroin, and it contributed to over 80% of overdose deaths in Maryland. Anyone who uses drugs, even occasionally, is at risk of an overdose. Learn to reverse an overdose with an easy-to-use medication called naloxone at beforeitstoolate.maryland.gov or call 211 and press 1.
This program is made by MPT to enrich the diverse communities throughout our state and is made possible by the generous support of our members. Thank you.
Connecting Marylanders to their government. This is State Circle.
Good evening. Welcome to State Circle. Coming up tonight, with Pimlico renovations stuck in the starting gate, things are changing nearby. And Nancy Amata has our Salute to Veterans report. But first tonight, the racially motivated killings of 10 black residents in a Buffalo supermarket. President Biden called it an act of domestic terrorism. Tonight, analysis of the ideology that apparently motivated the gunman. We spoke with two experts on race and extremism. Kurt Braddock of the School of Communication at American University, a faculty fellow in the Center for Polarization and Extremism Research, and Raymond Winbush, research professor and director of the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University. We begin with Professor Winbush.
It's nothing new. In fact, it won't be the last one either. We saw one in 15 of a black church in Charleston, South Carolina. And it's ironic, I read this guy, Peyton Grindon's, so-called manifesto. And it's, he references that attack. So it's nothing new. It comes out of this whole thing about, they call it great replacement theory, but it's really just old history about race in America.
Torn a little bit between not wanting to give any attention to the perpetrator of something like this or whatever ideology might be behind it, and on the other hand, wanting to understand it better. How do you think about that?
Well, it's kind of ironic right now that we're talking about critical race theory where you don't look at the past, but how do you look at, white replacement theory, which is about the past, and that's why history is so important. I think what you have to do is say that it's nothing new. It's, old wine in new bottles, if you please, and that people are still revisiting some of the same old racial canards and things that we thought as a nation that somehow we had put in our past, and it hasn't been put there.
So it's the same stuff the KKK was mimeographing and handing out 50 years ago, maybe dressed up a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, you hear it with Brown versus Board. If they go to school with our daughters, they're going to marry our daughters. During the Reconstruction, if you go back even further than that, when blacks were being elected to office, they're going to take our place, as if there was some place reserved in, government for white male landowners. So this is nothing new. It's just, again, it's dressed up in, better clothes, if you please, but it's still the old racism of fear. As Chuck D from Public Enemy called it, the hip hop group, he said, it's the fear of a black planet.
Well, the country, there's no doubt about the demographics. I mean, it's going to be a majority minority nation, and and for somebody who's somehow motivated by that, killing black people in Buffalo isn't going to change that, or do they see that differently?
Well, I think he does. I mean, I've read at least about a fourth of his manifesto. He clearly says that he's not racist. He said that he's only racist against those who invade white lands. Now, America originally was not a white land, but he strongly believes that we, black people, brown people, Asian people, are what he calls the replacers. And he feels threatened by this, and he feels that this is a land that he has to defend in order to maintain white supremacy.
The Morgan State website biography of you says that you follow a systems thinking approach to understand the impact of racism and white supremacy. Help us understand what a systems thinking approach is, and how it helps you wrap your head around this.
Well, racism is a system. A system is something that is self-contained, that perpetuates itself, that keeps moving. I think that racism is probably the epitome of a system that works for those who it was designed by. I think that we tend to use words like lone wolf, like what happened in Buffalo occurs, that somehow he acted alone. He's the exception rather than the rule. We'll hear President Biden even say things such as, "This is not who we are. We're better than this." But then you have to look at history and wonder if that he is just a reflection of a system that has encouraged violence against Black people for hundreds of years in the form of enslavement, and not only just against Black people, but indigenous people in this country as well, with Chinese exclusion acts 100 and something years ago. So all of that is violence, and that's the idea of a systems approach to understanding racism.
So whatever people might be behind it, the books that have been written that animate this, are they happy that there was violence? I mean, is that something that advances their objectives in some way, or does it harm them politically at all?
Well, I think they squirm. I think that they're going to deny that they would ever encourage violence. They will call, what's his name, Great Grindon or Gendron, whatever his name is, they will call him a racist and acting individually. But they're also blowing a dog whistle. And they are telling people, look, the only way you can stop these hordes from the southern border, the immigrants from Haiti, Black people who have been here for hundreds of years, is to get rid of them. I mean, this country tried it, structurally right after the Civil War with, return to, African immigration policy and stuff. So, they can deny it, but they are the ideological precursors to this stuff. And it's been here for a while.
How do you deal with an incident like this on an interpersonal basis? I'm thinking about your students. You have graduation coming up at Morgan this weekend, and in a classroom situation, you're probably not in class right now, but if you're lecturing a group of young people at a largely African American community, what would you want them to think when I'm sure they have a ton of questions?
Well, they do. And this is always a depressing lecture after something like this happened. I put aside the textbooks, and I have to talk to students about being Black in America, how they are processing this. You would be surprised how many students cry and get depressed about things like this. And you also have to be surprised about how many are angry about it and want to do something about it. And as a professor, you've got to be able to talk that through. lessons aside for today, and we're going to talk about being Black in America.
Is there a racial aspect to the gun debate in America? I mean, this individual, the perpetrator, despite a history of mental illness, was able to go out and buy an assault weapon.
Well, of course there is. I mean, if you go all the way back to when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, the National Rifle Association, the main encourager, if you please, of arms in this country, was opposed to the Black Panther Party carrying guns that were unloaded in the state capitol at that time. The NRA. Now the NRA is the exact opposite. It's interesting that when we have these tragedies like what happened in Buffalo, that you don't hear them say that much. They'll say this is not the time to politicize the matter. The Democrats will talk primarily about guns. The Republicans will talk mainly about mental health. And neither of those get at either of those things. Very quickly, he said in his manifesto that he was not mentally ill. In fact, he actually has a recorded IQ test or something that he took saying that he is mentally capable. But it's not a matter of getting rid of guns. It's a debate over guns, but you will never be able to control the amount of guns in the United States because guns can last for 150 years. The problem is the ammunition, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Our thanks to Professor Winbush. Now our conversation with Professor Braddock of American University.
Ever since 2008, really, we've seen a change in the kinds of extremism that we're seeing. Obviously, after 2001, we were pretty focused on Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic extremism. In 2008, though, we saw with the election of Barack Obama a huge spike in the number of militias and the number of white supremacist groups come about in the United States. And since then, we've seen a bit of an ascension. It kind of leveled off between 2008 and 2016. At 2016, though, when Donald Trump was elected, we saw a huge spike again. And now we're seeing kind of the fruits of that spike. And as the far right has grown in terms of the number of groups, the number of people that adhere to it, we see people becoming increasingly polarized as a response to that. So there is a risk moving forward of even increasing polarization and increasing extremism from now.
Is the replacement theory stuff a subset of historic white supremacism, or is it different in some way?
It's always been a part of white supremacism, given that it's based on the fear of somebody that is in the majority, in this case being white Americans, being replaced by a historic minority. That's always been a central fear of the white supremacist movement. The theory as it stands now, which is the idea in the United States that there are elites, which is basically a code word for Jewish people, controlling, pulling the strings, and essentially making it so that white Americans become the minority and are replaced by immigrants through immigration policies or through illegal immigration and through decreasing birth rates of white people and increasing birth rates of non-white people. Now, this originated in Europe, this kind of idea in terms of its contemporary version. It started in France, and since then it's been picked up by individuals in the United States, but it's a global historic idea.
And in France, it's more of a religious thing, right?
In France, the concern was that white France was being replaced primarily by Muslims who were emigrating there, as France has a pretty large Muslim population. And in 2011, a man named Renard Camus wrote something that said that essentially this was being orchestrated and that white France was being replaced.
Tell us about your research center at American University, Center for Polarization and Extremism Research. And you mentioned polarization before, the relationship between those two words.
Yeah, so what we see when people become polarized, and that's an interesting word because the American body politic has always been polarized. There's always been a left and there's always been a right.
It's a two-party system, right? I mean, and where isn't there a left and a right?
Yeah, and honestly, there should be a left and a right, or there should be opposing sides. That's what makes for a good, healthy democracy. But what we're seeing now is increasing demonization of the other group by each group. And although every political group throughout history has engaged in this kind of thing, now what we're seeing, if we look at the data of the number of people who are engaging in violence, planning violence, the number of groups, the number of militias, the far right has become a huge threat in the United States, according to the FBI, according to every database that we have in relation to extremism and violence. The far right poses the greater threat than the far left. That said, as the far right grows increasingly close to violence, it increases polarization because the far left feels as though it needs to have a response to what the far right is doing.
How much is polarization a function of changing media technology? So Walter Cronkite isn't the only voice out there anymore. And, there's no barriers to entry. Anybody can set up a crazy website. Really not that hard to start a TV network. And then the way you get noticed is you get loud and controversial and partisan.
Exactly. And you hit the nail on the head in two cases. Number one, anybody can go on the internet and there are no barriers to entry. And what we see when people do that is they develop their own little echo chambers where they get alongside other people who agree with their ideas, and they go down this spiral where they get increasingly extreme in their ideas. Also, the barriers to entry with respect to mainstream television aren't as high as they used to be as well. And a model that benefits people who speak increasingly extreme to generate ad revenue and to just to get eyeballs on them, it motivates this kind of thing. And we see it every night on cable TV.
Where's the line that concerns you? I mean, certainly there's always been a debate, hundreds of years in this country, about immigration policy, and I suppose there's room for debate over policy at the border and how many immigrants overwhelms the country or not, and or open borders are the right policy. But at what point does that debate slip into extremism in your view?
No, I think you're right that open debate about policy is absolutely fair game. And again, that's what contributes to a healthy democracy here. But what we're seeing increasingly, especially since 2016, is rhetoric coming from public officials that demonizes and dehumanizes individuals like immigrants. There have been statements made by public officials that have kind of jokingly said that maybe we should shoot people at the border, things like that, or we should shoot people who facilitate immigration into the United States. That, I think, is the line. Once we start demonizing the other and making it okay to engage in violence against them, I think that's the line. Now, that line is fuzzy because the First Amendment is sacrosanct to the United States, to me personally. So it's a debate that needs to be had about where is that line and at what point do people step over it?
Well, and you personally focus on that in your study, the words. I mean, what are some examples of words that maybe cross that line?
Well, the perfect example is, and this is something that's debatable in terms of legal decisions, is what happened on January 6th. Although Donald Trump was acquitted in the Senate for the things that he said in terms of inciting what happened on Capitol Hill that day, incitement has a very, very huge proof threshold. The laws in the United States dictate that for somebody to be convicted of incitement, they need to say something that directly affects the violence. But that said, research shows that you can draw a line between the kinds of things he said, like we need to show strength, we need to stop fighting so nice, we need to march up there and do something, we need to be persuasive to the people on Capitol Hill, especially given the people that he knew he was talking to. Couple that with the kind of things that I believe it was Rudy Giuliani who used terms like trial by combat and things like that. They're very clever in that they don't overtly direct violence, but the people that are there, when there are millions of people listening, hundreds of thousands of people listening, at least one of them is likely to take that as a call to violence. And we saw many people do that on January 6th.
How about the line between what they call the dark web and normal social media stuff? I mean, Twitter, parts of Twitter are just a sewer. I mean, is the stuff that's on the dark web that much different?
I mean, in many cases, it's worse. I think the line is really, it's not so much a line as to what's here versus what's there, but it's how well this stuff is moderated. The shooter in Buffalo, he spent a lot of time in unmoderated type spaces like 4chan, which, although there is claimed to be moderation there, it's nowhere near as strict as you would see on a Twitter or a Facebook or something along those lines. That seems to be the big distinction between the two, is how well hate speech and inciting speech is moderated on these kinds of channels.
So after any terror incident where it looks like a lone wolf, you know, it's common to ask in the media if the person acted alone. When you look at the totality of extremism, did this person in Buffalo act alone?
So you phrase it interestingly. There's a term that I and many others that study terrorism hate called lone wolf. And a lot of people use that term, lone wolf. And we hate that term for two reasons. Number one, it kind of lionizes the attacker. And number two, it suggests that they came up with this idea on their own. They acted on their own. They were completely independent of anything else. And that's, for the most part, a lie. This individual was engaging with others online. He was seeking out content related to the white supremacist movement online. He was engaging with propaganda that he had gotten from groups and other individuals related to the Great Replacement. So the motivation for his attack was absolutely done in concert with other people. So a term we like to use, and you said acted, we like to use the term lone actor, because he acted alone, but he didn't get this idea by himself.
Our thanks to Dr. Braddock. Now, the second jewel in the Triple Crown, the Preakness, is scheduled for tomorrow in Baltimore. Charles Robinson looks at what's in store.
This year is my 49th consecutive Preakness, both of us.
Old Hilltop has been known many, many years here, and if they would move this, it would never be the same.
The 147th running of the Preakness at Pimlico is a sort of a last hurrah before renovations. Designers will make major changes to the track in 2023, turning the surface 30 degrees and raising the grandstands. With less than a month of horse racing, the track is on a charm offensive. It's invited groups and families to get up for sunrise and learn about those who work at the track. There's also been an expansion of entertainment with the Preakness Live Culinary Art Festival on Friday night and live music during Preakness Day.
Part of the renaissance here in the Park Heights community will include the Pimlico racetrack, but it's actually going to include the entire neighborhood in and around the track.
This community has many, many homeowners. There's still great neighborhoods. There's a few challenges just like in any neighborhood across the country, but there are major assets in this community.
The community is in the middle of a 3 to 5 year implementation plan. As you drive through the community, you can see change, new housing and construction. In the past, the community didn't necessarily embrace the Preakness event. That is changing with complementary events.
I wanted people to understand that they are coming to Park Heights during the Preakness. And so every year, starting this year, we want to just make sure that when people hear about the Preakness, they also hear about Park Heights.
On the surface, the Renaissance might not be obvious, but the neighborhood contains some of the highest rates of home ownership in the city. Its assets include a major hospital and the Department of Motor Vehicles. They admit to the challenges, but see them as potential opportunities. At the Pimlico racetrack, I'm Charles Robinson for State Circle.
Now with our Salute to Veterans report, here's Nancy Yamada.
It's not just the service, it's the sacrifice.
Retired Brigadier General Edward Ballard says all veterans should be commended for not only what they signed up to do, but what they gave in order to serve.
A lot of sacrifice goes into being a veteran, especially if you're a combat veteran. And that's a difficult life.
Hosted by American Legion Post 122, the Brigadier General was the keynote speaker at an event honoring 25 veterans at Atrium Village in Owings Mills. Among them, 2 World War II veterans. David Rosenberg is 100 years old, and Dr. John Belcher is 96 years old. He was a combat engineer in the U.S. Army.
The combat engineers were the dropping of the bombs, the blowing up bridges, tearing up highways, and the combat engineers had to come back under combat condition, and restore communications, restore roadways.
Dr. Belcher can still vividly recall his 2 years of service. Some of those years were marked by the pain of being treated like he was less than his white counterparts.
I learned to live with it, but not to live with it. In other words, I was a pretty tough little cookie.
No matter how many years have passed, he says it feels good to be acknowledged.
I appreciate the effort, and I do consider it an effort, because those were days, they were years that were just, we weren't asked.
When it comes to honoring veterans, time is literally of the essence. On average, 245 World War II veterans die every day.
I'm proud of my service.
Korean War veteran Marty Zuckerman says being in the military was a great foundation for the rest of his life.
I was in the Transportation Corps, and what I learned there helped me in my business. I learned all about transportation. I could drive a tractor trailer, I could operate a crane.
He says he's against war, but believes in serving your country.
I don't want to see them have to go. I also believe that every youth, male or female, should have to put in maybe a year, 18 months to go into training, which it makes you a better person.
And collectively, a better nation.
Our debt to these heroes can never, ever be repaid. But our gratitude and our respect must last forever.
I'm Nancy Yamada for State Circle.
And that is State Circle for this week. Join us Monday for Direct Connection. We will get answers to your questions about the increasing incidence of strokes in younger patients. That's live Monday evening at 7. Please remember to follow us on Twitter at MPT News. And now for all of us at MPT, thanks for watching and have a good night.
MSATP is a collective embodiment of accounting, tax, and financial service businesses. We're committed to providing quality and affordable education, technical and personal support, and opportunities for building business. Visit msatp.org to learn more.
Start your wellness journey today at the Wise and Well Center.